Okay, good day, everyone. It's Matt English here, and Tom Thompson from Esri Canada. We're both in the Toronto office. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon our time, and for the next hour, we're going to be talking about tooling up to be an ArcGIS developer. A couple of quick housekeeping items here. At any time during the presentation, if you feel like you want to ask us a question, you can just go to the Q&A panel. You'll see that the Q&A panel can be activated from the bottom of the WebEx user interface. And just make sure that you kind of ask all panelists, and so that we, both Tom and I, will see the question, and we'll do our best to answer them in the Q&A panel. Then if we have time at the end, we can sort of informally, verbally answer those questions as well. Okay, so for today's agenda is really three main points. The first thing we want to talk to you about and get you introduced to is an IDE, or an integrated development environment, called Visual Studio Code. It's a free downloadable IDE, and it's become very widely popular in the development community. And we want to show you how you can set up Visual Studio Code to support your Python development, both with ArcPy and the ArcGIS API for Python, as well as look at how you might do JavaScript development with our set of APIs using Visual Studio Code. So the good news is that I'm not a big fan of slides, so most of this is just going to be live software demonstrations. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is Visual Studio Code. Get you familiar with where you get it and how you run it and so on. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, great. You should see my screen here, and we'll just pull up Google Chrome. So all you need to do here is, so I'm just opening up a web browser, and if you just Google VS Code, hit it right here, and click the first link that you come to, and this is it, right? You download it here from this link. You choose the build that is appropriate for your operating system, and then you download it. It's a free download, and I'm about to show you some of the features of Visual Studio Code, which I think will be quite compelling for those of us who are doing a lot of ArcGIS development across the platform. So that's where you get it, okay? And I'm going to just pop open Visual Studio Code here. It's down in my tray. And let's not worry about the code you're looking at right here, but when you first start up Visual Studio Code, and by the way, it starts up super quick. One of the nice things about VS Code is that it's extremely lightweight. It doesn't take much to get this thing up and running. At any time, go to Help and Welcome. And this kind of gives you this sort of intro page to Visual Studio Code. One of the things that I like to just point out at the beginning of this, so that you get familiar with the user interface of VS Code, is you go down to the Learn section and hit Interface Overview. Okay, so this overlays a little sort of a help layer on top of the UI. So upper left is the File Explorer. So it's nice to have a file explorer, obviously, when you're working with your set of files that you're developing with. Below that is you can search across the files. You can search for a file name, or you can search for a word in a file. What's really nice is integrated right into VS Code is source code management. So you can set it up to use things like Git and GitHub. That's important when you're doing anything, I would say, more than writing a script, and you obviously want to keep track of the development of your code, so you can do that. It's built right into VS Code, and we'll demonstrate that just a little bit later. You can also debug code, and Tom will show this with respect to Python in just a few minutes. One of the big things about Visual Studio Code is the extension library or extension ecosystem. So there's lots of plugins that you can easily access that will make your life a lot simpler when using VS Code. We're still in sort of the interface overview sort of layer here, and then anytime there's ways to click buttons to get at things, but if you hit Control-Shift-P at any time, it brings up the command window, and you can start typing in commands, and you'll be able to get at commands for things like Python and JavaScript. At the bottom is sort of like a status bar where you can see errors and warnings, things that are going on, and also notifications on the lower right. So just to hit Escape here, and let's just go ahead and do that. So that's kind of, you download it, you start it up, it's super quick and easy, and now what we're going to do is we're going to kick off a section on wiring up the various aspects of ArcGIS Python development with VS Code. So with that, we're going to pass it over to Tom.
All right, thank you, Matt. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio Code, and a part of my role at Esri Canada is working in technical support as part of the developer support team. And being on this team, we get a very high volume of cases in Python. And over the past little while, I've found that Visual Studio Code is a very valuable tool for me to work within a Python environment, to troubleshoot my cases and to assist our clients to resolve their problems a little bit more quickly. And so I've found a lot of tools and settings within Visual Studio Code which I think you'll find very valuable. And so as Matt mentioned, we can add extensions to Visual Studio Code. And so on the left-hand side, I'm going to select the extensions option here, and you'll see the extensions that I leverage within Visual Studio Code. And the primary one that I work with is the Python extension from Microsoft. And this extension has many very valuable features within it that I use day to day that are very valuable as a Python developer. And I just list them off here. One of them that I find very, very valuable is the IntelliSense feature. And this is a code suggestion or auto-completion feature within this Python extension. It also has linting, which is a type of passive code checking, and it's able to tell us potential issues within our scripts or in our code that may be problematic before actually debugging it. So that's really handy, and I can show you some of that as well. It has debugging, as Matt mentioned, and I'm going to go through that in one of my Python scripts here. It has Jupyter Notebooks, which with the adoption of WebGIS, being ArcGIS Online or Portal for ArcGIS, the ability to work within the Python API is increasing. You're able to leverage this Python API to work with your WebGIS content and automate workflows. And so I'm going to show a little bit about that and the data visualization aspect of Jupyter Notebooks, which is really handy for developers who prefer to sort of see more what they're working with instead of staring at just text in their IDE. And then we also have environments, which you can switch between active environments within Visual Studio Code, and that's really handy. And so let's jump right in. Let's go to our File Explorer, and we're going to open a folder of Python scripts. And so I'm brought to my welcome screen, but on the left-hand side, you see I have all of my scripts that I'm going to use in this presentation. And you'll notice that just by coincidence, Matt and my appearance of our Visual Studio Code is pretty similar. And that is because through Visual Studio Code, you can apply a lot of custom settings. And one of these that I've used is the theme. And so we can access all of the themes within Visual Studio Code quickly and easily just by accessing the command palette with Control-Shift-P and typing in theme. And we get the command to access Preferences Color Theme. And so I'll hit enter here, and I'm given a list of all of the available themes within Visual Studio Code. And I guess Matt and I both prefer the dark Visual Studio theme, and so that's why ours looks very similar. But when I click enter, this is applied to a settings file. And I can find the settings file very quickly, again, using the command palette and typing settings, which will bring me to my settings JSON file. And this settings JSON file contains all of the customization that I've applied to Visual Studio Code to make this IDE sort of my own, so that I can be more efficient in my day-to-day work. And you can see the workbench color theme has been applied to Visual Studio Dark. But I'm not going to go through each of these, but we have some other settings which we can actively change on the fly here, like the font size. So I had it set to 18. I can just set this to 15, click Save, and you'll notice that that setting is automatically applied within Visual Studio Code. And so that's really handy for developers. If we want to be able to change something about our IDE quickly without wasting too much time going through UI, we can access this settings JSON, make that change, and we're ready to carry on with our development. And so we've installed Visual Studio Code. We have the extensions that we want to work with, in this case being the Python extension. We're ready to get coding in ArcGIS. And so how do I start by doing that? On the left-hand side, in my Explorer window, I can create a new file using the New File button here. And I'm going to name this file, just tooling up.py. And this is going to open up this new Python file within Visual Studio Code, and it's a completely blank slate. We have no code within this Python file. And so to get started in development within ArcGIS, we want to leverage the ArcPy module. And I import that ArcPy module by typing import ArcPy. And you can see that while I'm typing, Visual Studio Code and the Python extension is giving me a list of potential choices that I might have which are available to me in this Python environment. And this is IntelliSense. This is the IntelliSense feature within the Python extension, helping me code and giving me suggestions on what it might think that I'm looking for. And so in this case, it's correct. I'm looking for the Python extension, or the ArcPy module. I can just click enter. And now within this Python script, I have access to all of the functions within the ArcPy module. And so I'll just type ArcPy, and then I'll click dot. And again, what we'll see is that the IntelliSense is telling me all of the possible functions that I can leverage within this module. And so there's hundreds of these within ArcPy, and so we don't want to go through this list manually. We don't want to scroll down to find the specific one that we want to access. Instead, what we can do is we can just start typing that tool that we want to reach, or that function that we want to reach. And so in this case, I'm looking for the buffer analysis tool. And IntelliSense is saying, hey, I recognize that there is a function here. Maybe this is what you're looking for. And so I'll choose the buffer analysis function. I'll hit enter, and then I'll pass in some brackets. And so now what we're doing is we're able to pass parameters to this function so that the function can do work on what we're passing into it. And IntelliSense, again, is giving me some very, very valuable information. It's telling me that the buffer tool has required parameters. And the first one is that it requires in feature class. The second is that it requires an out feature class, and then also a buffer distance, or a field to buffer against. And for those of you who have used the buffer geoprocessing tool within ArcGIS Pro, these might sound familiar. And so I'm going to go into ArcGIS Pro here, and I'm going to search for the buffer tool. And when I select that tool, you'll see that the parameters which were shown in IntelliSense are also matching the buffer geoprocessing tool within ArcGIS Pro. So we have our in features, we have our out features, and we have our distance field or value. And so it's really as simple as that. You import the ArcPy module, and you can access the functions within it to begin automating your geoprocessing workflows. And so in this case, we're not going to build a Python script from scratch. We're going to go through a bit of a scenario where our supervisor has asked us to find all of the coordinates for each of the red light cameras in the city of Toronto. And now, being familiar with ArcGIS Pro, I can click on each of these features. I can see the coordinates in the pop-up window, and I could copy and paste this into Microsoft Word, or I could write them down on a piece of paper. But we don't want to do that. That's really inefficient. As developers, we want to leverage Visual Studio Code and ArcPy to do this ourselves and to improve this and to save ourselves time so that we can work on other tasks. And so, by chance, one of our colleagues has given us a Python script which they used to do something similar in the past. And so within this script, we're importing ArcPy, just like I showed before, so we have access to all the geoprocessing tools and functions within it. And in this case, we're going to leverage the search cursor, which is part of the data access module. And the search cursor will loop through every feature in our feature class and acquire information about that feature. In this case, we're interested in knowing the shape field or the geometry. And so the only thing that I need to do is populate this fields list. And so through a search online, I was able to find a sample of how to do this. And it's just it leverages the ArcPy list fields function, and then it builds it into an array in Python. And so this isn't something that I want to automate. This is more of just a one-time task. So I'll go back into ArcGIS Pro, and I'll go to the Analysis tab, and then I'll use the Python window to run this. And I've copied this sample that I found. I can paste it into my Python window. Just hit Enter a few times, and you'll see that now it spits out a list of all of the fields within this feature class. So I'm going to copy this list. I'm going to come back to my scripts. I'm going to paste this into the fields variable. And so now we're ready to run the script. But before I do that, I didn't actually build this script myself. This was given to me from a colleague. I'm not sure if it's going to do what I want it to do. So I want to do some debugging. And specifically, I'm interested in knowing the contents of the row variable. And so we can add a breakpoint to this Python script. And you'll notice that when I put my mouse over the left-hand side of the line number, there's a little red dot. Now, if I click on this line, that's adding a breakpoint to this script. And what this means is that when we begin debugging, it's going to hit this line and pause debugging. And it's going to allow us to look more closely into the contents of our variables within this Python script. So I'll hit F5, and I'll select Python file to start debugging. And you'll see in the left-hand side, we're now in the debugging pane. The terminal at the bottom has run my script, and we break at my breakpoint. And it's telling us some information about our local variables. So our feature class variable is a string of red light cameras, and that's correct. But I want to look more deeply into the row variable. And so I can do that by adding a watch expression by clicking this little plus sign. So I'll click plus, and I'll type in row. And we'll see that we get an error on this variable saying name row is not defined. And that makes sense because we haven't actually executed this line of code yet. We've paused before it. So on my debugging toolbar at the top here, I want to step over this breakpoint and run the next line of code. And when I do that, you'll see that this row variable is now populated. It has our coordinates. And it's also telling us that this red light camera is at Dufferin Street and Glencairn Avenue. And when I step over again, you'll see that in my terminal, we're printing off the coordinates of this feature. And so I can take these coordinates and output them to a Excel spreadsheet and give that to my supervisor, and we saved ourselves a big chunk of time. And so that is how to watch variables and debug in Visual Studio Code. And I wanted to show one other thing, in which is linting. So say in this case, I'm unfamiliar with the name of the buffer function. So I'll just type in buffer, and I'll save this. And what we'll see is that we'll get a little red line underneath ArcPy. And that's the linter within Visual Studio Code telling us, hey, I think that there might be a problem with this. And so we mouse over it, and the linter is telling us that the ArcPy module has no buffer member. So this is essentially saying that I can't find a function within this module that exists that is named buffer. And so let's say we think that the linter is wrong. We want to actually just debug the code and see what happens. And so I'll hit F5 again. I will run my Python file, and we should get an error message. And we do. So we get an exception. Module ArcPy has no attribute buffer. And so in this case, the linter was correct. We should have believed what it said. We should have recognized that this red line was actually an issue, and instead maybe leveraged IntelliSense to say, hey, okay, the name of this function is actually buffer analysis. And so those are three really important things that I use in my day-to-day job within Visual Studio Code with debugging, IntelliSense, and the linting. And I also wanted to discuss the ArcGIS API for Python and Visual Studio Code's integration with Jupyter Notebooks. So I'll go back to my Explorer, and I'll go to my Jupyter sample. And so the ArcGIS API for Python is similar to ArcPy, except that it is designed to work with your web GIS content. And that means any hosted feature service or any content within your ArcGIS Online organization or your portal for ArcGIS. And so we can access those items. We can run analysis on them in some ways like you can with ArcPy, but it's all stored in the web. And so one major part of the ArcGIS API for Python is that you can leverage Jupyter Notebooks. And Jupyter Notebooks are a way to visualize the data that you're working with. And so if you're more of a visual learner, if you want to see more what you're working with, Jupyter Notebooks is really handy. And so there are two requirements to be able to use Jupyter Notebooks within Visual Studio Code. The first is that you have your Jupyter server running. And this server comes with ArcGIS Pro. So if you've installed ArcGIS Pro, you have a Jupyter Notebook desktop app. So I can click on this, and what will happen is it's going to launch my Jupyter server, and it's also going to launch a web browser. And typically with people working with Jupyter Notebooks, they'll do development within a browser. And there are some disadvantages to that. And so in this case, I don't want to code in this browser window. I want to code within Visual Studio Code. So I'll close this, and I'll come back to my Jupyter Notebook server. And I'll just want to copy this URL here. And within Visual Studio Code, I'll access the command palette. And I'll type Jupyter. And I get the command to specify Jupyter server URI. So I'll hit enter, and then I get two more options. The second option is to type in the URI to connect to a running Jupyter server. So I'll select that. I'll paste in my URI and hit enter. So now Visual Studio Code is connected to my Jupyter server. The second requirement is that within Visual Studio Code, I use this little key here, and that's #% %. And when I do that, you'll notice that this little run cell option becomes visible. And this is telling Visual Studio Code that I want to run this through a Jupyter Notebook and not just through a standalone Python script. So we can click on Run Cell, and the Python interactive window is going to pop up on the right-hand side here. And this is where the visualization aspect of Jupyter Notebooks will be displayed and be leveraged. And so we see the Jupyter server has been connected. We're importing our ArcGIS API for Python module, which you'll notice looks different than just the ArcPy module. And then we're connected to our WebGIS, being ArcGIS Online. And so in this case, I'm just interested in seeing some information about a hosted feature service that I've published named Earthquake Since 1970. So I've got my key, and I'm going to click Run Cell on this cell of code. And what you'll see is on the right-hand side, Jupyter Notebooks can display our data to us and show us the symbology applied to the hosted feature service, the item details of that, as well as the number of views. And I can actually, through the Python interactive view, click on this link, and it's going to take me to my WebGIS, in this case ArcGIS Online, and take me to exactly where this hosted feature service is stored. And so that is super handy as well, especially with the adoption of ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online. This is going to become a very big thing. And so being able to work within Visual Studio Code and not within a browser window, I found is very, very handy. And so that's what I rely on and what I use in my day-to-day job within Visual Studio Code and in Python.
Great, Tom. That was awesome. So to kind of sum up where we are, sort of halfway through this web seminar, is we looked for VS Code download, downloaded it, installed it, added a couple of useful extensions, and then we were able to start writing scripts using ArcPy, as well as the Python API for ArcGIS. I thought the interesting thing that Tom showed with respect to the Python API for ArcGIS is Jupyter Notebook integration. It may be in your daily work that you don't need visual output, like you're writing scripts that are ETLing data from one of your systems out to, let's say, ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. So in that case, you would still use the ArcGIS API for Python, but you may not need to integrate with the Jupyter Notebook. But a lot of times for development purposes, it is nice to kind of do what Tom did there, which was add those percentage flags so that we could actually run it inside a Jupyter Notebook. Okay, so we are going to just switch here. So I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. And okay. So I started work at Esri in 1998. So I've been doing this for just a little over 20 years, and started my career in Redlands, California at the mothership. And, you know, obviously in 20 years, lots of things have changed, but it's funny, like two things have remained relatively constant in this kind of sea of change that is, you know, IT and technology trends. Number one is that I've been working with Python for almost all of those years, right? Now, sure, the APIs have changed and the capabilities, but having the skills to write Python scripts has been a relative constant for me during this sea of change. The other thing is this, and that is JavaScript development. So 20 years ago when I was in Redlands, that was kind of the early days of ArcIMS, and I very quickly had to learn JavaScript in order to tweak ArcIMS. And all these years later, we're still using JavaScript. And you have very large companies who are sort of betting heavily on JavaScript development, so much so that they even advertise on the sides of buses that, hey, You don't need to go to an app store created by Steve Jobs in order to download an app in order to use our stuff. We've written you a web application using JavaScript that works really well. And we're starting to see a trend now with PWAs, that stands for Progressive Web Apps, where it's a browser-based app, but you can add the icon to your home screen, and it kind of, to the end user, it looks and feels like a real app, but it's actually just a JavaScript, HTML, CSS web application. So I don't know. I think it's fairly good news from an ArcGIS standpoint that we've been doing Python development for all these years, Python scripting, and the JavaScript skills that we have had for all these years are maybe even more important now as we're starting to see this trend towards progressive web applications. Okay, so that's that. What I kind of just wanted to show you before I dive into working with JavaScript and Esri stuff and VS Code is just run through the developer website just real quick here. So ArcGIS dev is all you need to type in. I'm a big fan of Google because I don't have to store many things in my brain anymore. I can type a few letters into a search box and everything comes to me. It's incredible. All right, ArcGIS for developers. The website's kind of been reworked in the last few weeks. Really, just you're on the website here, and very quickly are all the sort of developer options for you, and the offerings that we do have as part of our developer package. And by clicking on any of these, of course, you can get to the specific APIs, right? Look at a guide on how to build apps using JavaScript as well as API references. So, and then if we just go back here, let's just go back and start building your app. When you click that Start Building Your App, what we've noticed is, especially people who are new to Esri technology, and they're kind of excited to begin to work with our stuff, whether it be out of the box stuff or building scripts or writing apps, is that sometimes it can be a little bit daunting about where to kind of dive in. So when you hit that Get Started, you end up essentially right here where there's lots of tutorials, right? So you can explore tutorials by the API or the SDK, or about sort of functional things. Like I want to build a starter app in JavaScript or Android. How do I do that, right? So there's tutorials on how to do that. So that's all good and dandy, right? So just remember ArcGIS Dev. Google that, and you'll come up with the developer homepage. It's been reorganized, and hopefully you'll like the way it has been organized. So we want to talk a little bit about JavaScript development, and specifically something that's many of you probably have worked with is the web app builder for ArcGIS Developer Edition, right? It's a nice way of taking your JavaScript skills, letting Esri kind of worry about the UI UX of a web mapping application, and let you really just kind of focus on business logic, right? It's been a wildly popular tooling set for Esri developers. All right, so kind of want to show you how VS Code works with the web app builder for ArcGIS Developer Edition, and I want to do it in context with if you're a developer and you're building widgets, then how do you deal with getting your widgets to your end users, right? And one of the interesting workflows is, I'm just going to open up this tab here. If you look at the ArcGIS Enterprise, and specifically the portal component, there's a help doc on essentially adding custom widgets to Web App Builder Developer Edition. And this is if you're kind of unsure of this workflow, it's a pretty interesting workflow. So you can write code, deploy a widget to an accessible web server, right? So really all you need here is you basically just need, let me just stop right here. So you basically need a web server. And from that point on, people who are using Web App Builder in ArcGIS Enterprise can actually browse for your widget that you've developed, optionally in VS Code or a development environment of your choice, and be able to leverage that functionality inside ArcGIS Enterprise, and in particular inside Web App Builder. So we can start with Web App Builder Developer Edition and work our way through a set of steps to deploy custom widgets for our organization. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through that in context with VS Code. So let's go here. So you need a web server. A couple things you need. You need a web server, and you need ArcGIS Enterprise. So let's just take a look at ArcGIS Enterprise from an end user perspective at this point, and then we'll get into the tooling and the wiring up of this stuff. So we start sort of at the end of the process, so you get a feel for what we're trying to do. So here I'm logged into ArcGIS Enterprise and the portal component of ArcGIS Enterprise. And what I'm going to do is just going to go to my content here. I'm going to look at a couple things here. I'm going to look at this web mapping application. This was authored by someone who is configuring applications in our organization. I'm an end user and I just kind of want to use the app. So I'm just going to view the application. And this is an ArcGIS Enterprise utility network. Okay, and utility networks, kind of like geometric networks, if you're familiar with those, are all about, at least in the electric context, about if a person calls because there's an outage, would there be a way for us as an operator of the utility to isolate what could potentially be the problem, right? And so in order to do that, you need to do things called network traces. So let's just show you how. Let's just show you how that looks. So I'm going to bring up a utility network tracing widget. Okay, so I'd like to know on my electric distribution, on my electric distribution network, what's downstream of a certain point, right? And so I can click here, and all of these customers, if there was a problem here, then all of these customers could potentially be affected. If there was a problem here, all of these customers. If there was a problem here, all of these customers. And if all of people started calling right here, we can do an upstream trace and find out what could be the source of that. And that takes you back to essentially a substation in here. Okay, so that's a little bit of, that's just a little bit of a snippet of how electric utilities do work with outages. People call and they need to be able to isolate where in the distribution system potential problems are. In order to do that, we need to be able to do upstream and downstream tracing, and we can do that with ArcGIS with geometric networks and the new utility network. Okay, so this here is a custom widget that I developed, and I used Visual Studio Code to develop it. And if we go back to this doc right here, it said, yeah, okay, so cool. So you can build a custom widget, and you can host it on a web server. So you need some kind of web server. So one of the interesting things about, we'll get into this, we'll get into the code sharing in just a minute, but we heavily use GitHub at Esri Canada, and lots of people use GitHub. GitHub is a way of basically sharing your code and making your code better, because you can invite community members to tweak how your code works and so on. So it's really a community building effort to share your code and make it better. If you need a web server in GitHub, my username here is Esri Canada. If I create a repository called esricanada.github.io, I get a free web server, and it looks like that. So if I take the URL esricanada.github.io and put it in a web browser, I actually get a free web server. So that's interesting. So what I can actually do here is, so this is answering the question right here, I need a web server, right? I'm choosing GitHub to be my web server. And in there, I have a set of custom widgets, and I have a utility network widget, and in there are all the files for doing widget development. And in In those files are the lines of code that I would have written on my desktop and essentially managed through GitHub. And I'm going to show you how all of that works in just a second. Okay. All right. So if you read through the doc essentially says that I need to create something called an application extension inside the portal component of ArcGIS Enterprise. So that looks like this. If I go here, so I haven't even gone to the code yet. I'm just showing you how to wire up a workflow in order for you to go from writing code on your laptop or your desktop to a web server that can be then used to support custom widgets inside Web App Builder as part of ArcGIS Enterprise. Okay, so what I did is I followed the doc and I created an app builder extension. It just looks like this, and it essentially just references that that code which sits on GitHub. Okay, so this application extension in Portal essentially references my GitHub code right here. Okay, so then let's take a look at one other thing here. So that's from an end user perspective. Now, so I've got the moving parts set up: a web server, an application extension type, of which I've registered the custom widget that's sitting, in my case, on GitHub, but it could be, you have different kinds of web servers. So as long as you have an accessible web server, here's what it kind of looks like. So if I go back to content, and I'm working with this web mapping application. This time I'm a configurator person. I'm not the end user, but I'm building and configuring and deploying web mapping applications. I can edit. And again, this is inside ArcGIS Enterprise. And widgets. And here, let's add a widget to this controller down here. And basically, when you hit add, when you set up all those moving parts, you essentially you've got your default set of widgets, but then custom right here, and they show up right here. So there's the GitHub utility network widget, which is available to the person in my organization who's configuring end user web mapping applications. Okay, so there's the moving parts and the workflow. So let's just kind of go back to Visual Studio Code. We're not going to spend too much time in the code, but what we will do here is just go here, and here's the code. I'm going to come down to a spot just down here for 1 second. Okay, so right here, Tom showed some extensions. I like this one. This one's really cool. So I go here and down here and just search for bracket pair colorizer. It's really slick. A lot of times when you get lots of indents and you want to keep track of curly braces, square braces, and so on, it can get a little bit daunting, especially if you've worked with our Web App Builder Developer Edition and you have to do lots of lang dot hitches. You end up with, okay, I want to keep track of opening and closing braces. So what you do is you enable bracket pair colorizer. It's an extension. Just enable it. And okay. And then your brackets change colors, right? So if I want to know where the closing brace for that open brace, it draws me a nice little line here to there, right? If I want to know if I properly close my braces, this is a super nice feature, right? Bracket pair colorizer. It can save you a lot of headache, because most of you know, if you've done JavaScript development, if you leave off a closing paren or squiggly brace, your app will error out in the web browser, and it can be a little bit of a nightmare sometimes trying to figure out, have you missed something? Anyway, bracket pair colorizer is a nice little extension for you. What I want to show you next is just GitHub integration. Okay, so let's go here, and let's just head right here. And to begin GitHub work, you can hit Control-Shift-P and pull up all your Git commands by typing in git. Here's one called git clone, which essentially allows me to take the URL of a repository that I have in GitHub and essentially download all of the code and start to synchronize it with my local machine, okay? All right, so once I've got that set up, this thing kind of comes to life. And if I decide to make a change to the code, I'll just uncomment a line here, Control S to save. You will notice that a little badge appears right here. Okay, it says, yeah, I've got changes locally. Now I want to sync them up with my repository in GitHub, and I can do this. I'm just going to stage this change. I've just changed one thing here, put it here, and update. Control Enter to do it. Changes are done. Then I'm going to synchronize with GitHub any changes that I've made. Say, yeah, cool. And this just does a synchronize. So the point of what I'm showing you here is we've kind of covered a bunch of different things, right? Covered the moving parts that allow you to get to custom widget deployment into ArcGIS Enterprise Web App Builder. And you've done that with the Web App Builder Developer Edition locally on your machine here. We've enabled extension to help us with making sure our bracket pairs are colorized and we haven't missed anything. Then I'm just showing you essentially source control integration, right, with GitHub. So we uncommented this, so this is now a live sort of line in our code. And if we head back here to GitHub, and if we hit refresh, that line has now been uncommented, right? Okay. So that's to show you how you can go from essentially source control locally on, in my case, a laptop, to a repository, in my case, hosted on GitHub. Okay. All right, so that is a quick look at JavaScript. We're not really focusing too much on the code here. We're just focusing on what we think are some key workflows for you for working with things like Web App Builder. All right, the next thing I wanted to take a look at is, let's go back to the web browser here. And, okay, we're good there. Okay, the next thing that's come up in the last couple, 3 years, a technology built by Microsoft, but now just super widely adopted for building large-scale applications. TypeScript is really essentially a superset of JavaScript that is strongly typed, meaning you get IntelliSense on it when you're actually writing TypeScript. And then you hit a little compile command, and it just basically transpiles everything into just normal, everyday JavaScript. And it's become very popular for building sort of larger scale applications. Developers really like it because they get code completion, IntelliSense, and checking up front when they're actually writing their web-based applications. Okay, so that's TypeScript. Let's show you how you get all that configured with VS Code and for using our ArcGIS API for JavaScript. So back to the developer's website, and if you go to the JavaScript API guide and you go down to developer tooling, TypeScript setup, it essentially gives you what you need, the instructions needed to get TypeScript running. You're using something called NPM, Node Package Manager, to make it all happen. And then when you build an app, you're basically inside your root folder going to get a structure that looks like this. And then you do one other thing, which is install the ArcGIS API for JavaScript typings into your application. And then once that's done, you're good to go with TypeScript development. So let's take a quick look at what sort of what that looks like in VS Code. This is kind of, some of you may be doing TypeScript development already, some of you may not be. As we progress through releases of our developer technology, on the JavaScript side, the dev team in Redlands, they all use VS Code and TypeScript to actually build the API. Web App Builder Developer Edition currently does not support TypeScript. It's just kind of plain Jane JavaScript, but it sounds like the next gen version of Web App Builder Developer Edition, called the Experience Builder, will be using JavaScript. So this is just to give you a couple of quick pointers in how to get set up for TypeScript development. And it's pretty easy with Visual Studio Code. So let's go back here. Let's go into here. So I have my first app that I built here, and in fact, it does kind of have that structure. It's got an app folder, and in this is a TypeScript file. It's got a package.json. It's got an index.html. And so if I go into the main.ts file, and this is where in the terminal, we can do all our npm installs, right? So you've got npm available here. So you can follow the tutorial along once you've installed npm. And if we go right here, so I'm looking at, this is basically the TypeScript version of our JavaScript API. And I'm just going to do one thing here. I've got a map view, and I'm going to put a comma in here and zoom. So it gives you IntelliSense right away. So when I'm creating a new map view in our 4.x JavaScript API using TypeScript on the ArcGIS API typings, I'm automatically getting IntelliSense about what I can do here. So I can go like this and say, okay, so I want the zoom to be a certain level when we zoom in on this map that I'm building. Cool. If I make that a string, it's going to complain about the fact that that's a string. So this is one of the most important sort of aspects of why TypeScript has become super popular, is that you get this sort of upfront intelligence about the code that you're writing. And it also makes it more friendly for if you're building libraries for other people to, when they're using your library that you've built inside their application, they get the benefits of this documentation essentially that's right here. It's kind of like self-documenting in a way. So that's cool. So that's not going to work. So I'm going to go here and just put that back to a number. We're good. I will save that, Control S, and then in order to compile it, the doc tells you how to do this. You can just hit the TypeScript compiler here. And what it does is it just kind of goes through, takes that TypeScript, and basically spits out a couple of JavaScript files for you. That's just plain Jane JavaScript. Okay, so what does that app look like right here? Let's go here. It's a web mapping application. I added my zoom level, so it's zoomed into a level of 10. It's a web map. It's the 4.x API, supports things like map rotation. All good. Supports pop-ups, supports docking pop-ups. So written in TypeScript and compiled to plain Jane JavaScript using VS Code. And then we'll just make one more change here just to kind of show you another thing that you can do here. Is if you don't want to recompile every time and say TSC every time you make a change to the code, you can say TSC -W for watch. So go ahead and watch for changes in the code. So it kind of sets up here. And then I'm going to comment out, not going to use a web map. I'm going to make this 3D, right? So I'm just going to, one of the ways to block comment a ton of code in Visual Studio Code is Control/, and that will just give you multi-line commenting. That's kind of a nice shortcut. And I'm going to go down to here and let's just get a web scene here. Instead, this is all just TypeScript versions of our 4.x JavaScript API. So if you watch down here, when I save this, if you kind of watch in here, I'll just hit Control S to save. It did started incremental compilation, so that finished. So this is kind of nice. So that's TSC -W, just to, anytime you save, it'll just recompile. And if we head back to our web mapping application, it's now a 3D web scene here using a scene layer. And because you're on WebEx, I'm not going to do too much refreshing here. I'll just let this try to let this refresh a little bit for you. So this is kind of, these are web scenes and essentially scene layer packages that have been published from ArcGIS Pro into a 3D web scene, in this case the Vancouver area. Okay, so let's just see where we are here. Let's go. We're almost done. Yeah, so this is just a bit of background on scene layers. Like if you're ever working with 3D, we have an open source project called i3s, and we invite community members to essentially help us with the spec to build these data sets that have large amounts of data, but that stream really nicely into web browsers. Okay, so that's a look at JavaScript, a workflow for going from custom widget development through to web app builder in ArcGIS Enterprise. We looked at how source control can work inside VS Code. And then we took kind of what I would consider maybe a sneak peek, but maybe not a sneak peek for some of you who are working in TypeScript, but a look at how to set up TypeScript development in VS Code. So let's just go here. We'll stop sharing the screen. And let's go through some sort of closing slides here. Okay, so we hope, and the good news is this is being recorded, so if you're like me and you can't remember anything and you need to type things into Google to remember stuff, that soon there will be a web recording of this, and so you'll be able to, we'll send you the link and you'll be able to rewatch it if you'd like. We really covered sort of three main things. A lot of us at Esri are big fans of VS Code, and I think the number one reason we are fans of it is that it's one integrated development environment for two pieces, big chunks of technology that have worked for us for over 20 years, right? So Python, JavaScript, and soon to be TypeScript, right? So that's kind of one of the reasons I use VS Code, is because the Esri development that I'm doing, I can become familiar inside one IDE to make that happen. And the IDE has a rich ecosystem of extensions and is very lightweight and starts up super quick. Okay, next slide. We're almost done here, folks. So a couple of resources. VisualStudio.com, that's where you download it. Looking for doc on anything to do with developing with ArcGIS, that's the developer's website. The other thing that I like to do is I like to follow the ArcGIS blog, and I just kind of look at I spend a lot of time in the developer section of the ArcGIS blog. And that's when I'm getting kind of news on a daily basis. Oh, we've got a new edition of Web App Builder Developer Edition ready for download. So I just kind of stay in touch with the blog. It's always a good thing. We do have some training courses coming up in the next little while. If you're so inspired by what Tom and I have showed you today and you want to dive deeper, but you feel like you need more of a sort of a formal structure around it, these are all one-day courses. So there's creating Python scripts for ArcGIS. There's one called Mastering ArcPy, and then Introduction to Web Development using ArcGIS API for JavaScript. And lastly, thanks a lot for attending. We really appreciate you folks taking the time out of your day to listen to what we have to say, and hopefully you find it useful. For those of you in Calgary, there's a user conference coming up next week, and I will be there. So please, I'll be there like all day. So please feel free to tap me on the shoulder and we can chat about things. And as always, there's our email addresses. I'm menglish@esri.ca and Tom is tthompson@esri.ca. So once again, folks, thanks for joining. It's been a real pleasure. And for those in Calgary, we'll see you in person next week if you're coming to the user conference. Thanks. Take care.